All right, can I welcome everybody here this morning to the release of this report, Immigration Detention in Australia, A New Beginning, Criteria for Release from Detention. This is the first of three reports that we, it's based on obviously on the inquiry on the terms of reference. The report addresses the criteria that should be applied in determining how long a person should be held in immigration detention, the criteria that should be applied in determining when a person should be released from immigration detention following health and security checks, review mechanisms for ongoing detention, removal practices and detention debts. There'll be a second and third report which will be tabled in 2009, which will address alternatives to detention, financial costs, service provision and infrastructure required to support the immigration detention framework in the future. I'm very pleased with this non-partisan report. It sets out a clear group of guidelines under which both the Australian public and detainees can judge the justice of their individual situations. They include a 5-day health check. After 6 months, the Ombudsman's review being reported on by the Minister to Parliament within 15 sitting days of the Ombudsman's recommendations. After 90 days for the completion of security and identity checks, the onus is on the Department to give people a bridging visa if the Minister was to accept our recommendations, and a maximum of 12 months in detention for all except those who've demonstrated a significant and ongoing risk to the community. In each of these areas, this is a complete change in the climate under which these issues are dealt with. The onus is on releasing people from detention rather than keeping them in. We also recommend that the publication of clear guidelines regarding how the criteria for unacceptable risk and visa non-compliance be applied. I just conclude before I take people's questions. It's the view of this committee that the Australian Government's role is to set policy that balances a fair and compassionate approach to asylum seekers with protections for the Australian community. And this report achieves that balance. We were far too cruel and inhumane in the past, and I think the new government with this new minister has set a new culture in the department regarding immigration altogether, and we, the committee, have come along and set some benchmarks for how an open and transparent process for that new culture ought to be perpetuated into the future.
You talk about clear guidelines for unacceptable risk being needed. Have you thought about what those guidelines, what form those guidelines would take?
Look, I think that we're quite confident that within the periods that we've recommended, 90 days, the vast majority of people have their identity and security checked. That was the evidence that we received from ASIO and from the department. We don't want people to be in immigration detention. We've only got 279 in immigration detention, 288 at the moment. And what we need to do is to keep the pressure on the department to make sure that people are released. The onus is very much the other way. The guidelines will have to be considered by the Minister very carefully, because we have obviously security environment which these kinds of things have to be considered very carefully. But after 30 days, we've found that under the current regime, most people who are unauthorised arrivals are being released. With the new benchmarks that we've set up, 90 days for a very senior review, 6 months by the Ombudsman, and then release with the possibility of a merit and process review after that. We think that that's a great new process.
You said that you visited all of Australia's detention centres in the course of this inquiry. What did you think the conditions were like?
Well, the Deputy Chair can say something on this too. I think from the information we've received from the past, conditions have improved greatly around the country. There is still, and the Minister has announced plans to fix stage 1 of Villawood. That is, in my view, unacceptable for not just members of the Australian Parliament, but members of the Australian public to have people in the kinds of conditions they are in stage 1. We particularly need to see that people who are being held in detention are not influenced by people who are being held there as a result of criminal convictions. And holding of people in those sort of mixed circumstances, I think, was something we found that was not right. I think a lot of the other detention centres, we found the operation by the Department of Immigration to be humane. The Christmas Island visit was very revealing, and I don't think there were any people in detention when we were there, but I believe they are now, and they're at the old Phosphate Hill site. The new Supermax that they had built at the end of the island, $400 million of taxpayers' money. I've made it clear before that I just think this was a grotesque reaction to the number of refugees and asylum seekers arriving around 2000, and most Australians would be shocked at the frankly the waste of taxpayers' money in that detention centre, and it has no one in it, and I hope it never will. And it's sitting there on Christmas Island, $400 million of Australia's taxpayers' money, rusting away.
Why has the committee recommended a maximum of 12 months time limit for detention?
We think it's inhumane to and irrational to hold people longer than that if there is, again, no evidence that they are going to be an unacceptable risk to the community. The evidence that we received was that most people through that period, I mean, we have a historically low number of people being held in immigration detention, thanks to the thorough work of the new minister in making sure that people who've been held in long-term detention have been released. But we think that holding people through the 3-month review by the senior people in the department, through the Ombudsman's review, that we're going to be able to deal with most people by that stage. There should be very, very few people held at the 12 months stage. Those very few that are